Welcome, Draft FPL managers, to our first video of the 24-25 season. In this one, my 5 tips for draft day success. Welcome back to the Draft FC podcast, the podcast website and YouTube channel dedicated to all things official Draft FPL. And welcome to the first video of the 24-25 season. For those of you new to the channel, a very warm welcome. My name is Mitch and I'm the host of the Draft FC podcast and YouTube channel and kind of head of our content here. We discuss everything to do with official Draft FPL. So if you are somebody that plays that game, we are hopefully going to be able to provide something of interest to you, both today, next week, next month, and hopefully for many more years to come. As well as providing you content, Draft FC also provides a number of tools for draft managers to help give you a leg up both on draft day and for the season as a whole. Amongst other things, we have got draft rankings, of course, so you'll be able to see my rankings, and they're updated pretty much every single day at the moment as new information becomes available. We also track and record every single draft that's taking place around the world every single day, and that is updated daily to condense that all into the same table that my draft rankings are in, so that as well as seeing my rankings, you can see how every manager around the world is also picking those players. As the season gets going, we've got our predicted lineups, which are extremely useful. They're free for everyone, but if you're a signed up member, you'll be able to get a whole lot more functionality with that. We'll be able to show you as Game Week 1 kicks off. We've also got our expected points model, which I'm really excited about because we've made some major improvements this summer, all thanks to my colleague, Draft FC Taran, who has been beavering away really hard on that, and I'm really looking forward to share that with you. Aside from that, we've also got ownership data, which you won't be able to find anywhere else. So as the season progresses, you'll be able to see who the players that are well owned are, who isn't very well owned. With that, we can also share to you the ownership swings from week to week, so you'll be able to see who are the players that the big managers are bringing in this week and who are the players that everyone's bringing in this week. And I can also use that information so that as we go through week to week, I'm able to guide you towards players that I think are likely to be available in your draft leagues, rather than just telling you to go and pick up Mo Salah and Erling Haaland, who in draft FPL, of course, are very unlikely to be available. So if any of that seems like it could be of interest to you, head over to draftfc.co.uk and you'll be able to find out more. For those of you watching on YouTube, make sure to hit that subscribe button if you're interested in seeing more draft FPL content over the coming days, weeks and months. And if you find anything useful from the video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up for us. To those of you joining us who have been with us before, welcome. It's been a nice break. Hope you're ready for another season of FPL Draft. Usually it feels like last season has only just finished by the time we're working on this content, but for me at least this year, feels like we have had a decent break. Kicking things off with an important pod for draft managers, both new and old, with an update of our tips for draft day success, which we have done before. I think I did one last year just purely on audio, but this will be the first time that we're able to bring it to YouTube as well with a bit of a visual element. Over the coming days and weeks, we'll be putting out a lot of the content that you might have become accustomed to if you are familiar with our stuff. We'll be doing deep dives on each of the positions, starting with the goalkeepers in the next couple of days, defenders, midfielders and forwards. Within each of those, I'll share a handful of my rankings as they are accurate at the time. But as I said a minute ago, for the full ranking of mine, you need to be a signed up member at draftfc.co.uk. But you'll be able to get an idea of some of my player picks in those episodes, so stay well tuned for those. Aside from that, I will be trying to get out as much content as I physically can before Game Week 1. So I'll be constantly beavering away every day. So make sure you are subscribed or following wherever you do listen or watch so that you don't miss out on those as soon as they appear. But without further ado, let's get into this episode. So I think last year I did 10. I may have had a different number before, but for this episode, I've boiled it down to what I think are the 5 most important tips for draft day success. Some of these are going to be very basic, so if you've been a draft manager for a few years and know your way around a draft day, may not be that every one of these tips is directly going to be useful for you, but hopefully there's something in there for everyone, so stay tuned even if you consider yourself a bit of an expert. Let's start off with the most important one. Fail to prepare or prepare to fail. The simplest and most obvious piece of advice, but I'm saying it again anyway. You will only turn up to one draft having not prepared and that will be enough to see you never make that mistake again. When you're suddenly on the clock and your heart rate's picking up and you completely forget how to spell Haaland as you're trying to type it in and find him, it's amazing how quickly panic can set in. My league is entering its 8th season this year, and there are still moments in the drafts that managers have to panic pick someone with only a couple of seconds to spare. Rather than finding this out the hard way, simply don't make the mistake in the first place and set aside some time in the coming days and weeks to cast your eye over your potential targets for the season ahead. This doesn't have to be a huge piece of work. Even if you sketch out your top 25 players, at least when your turn comes around in those opening rounds, you'll have an idea of who you want and you won't go and panic pick Gabriel Jesus. Better still, sketch out your favourites for each of the positions so you know some targets even further into the draft too that you've got your eye on. Even better still, create a spreadsheet with a whole host of the players. Download all of the players. You can easily find those available online and have a prediction of how many points you think they're going to get and then rank them, and you've got a complete list that you can use for a much better idea on draft day. If you want to get even more technical, you could undertake a value-based strategy to gain an edge over your opponents. I'll talk a little bit more about that in my next tip. And even better than all of that, why not just head over to draftfc.co.uk and sign up for our pre-season pack, and you'll be able to access all of our rankings put together by some draft veterans, as well as a good expected points algorithm behind it to back up some of the subjectivity with some objectivity. Tip number 2 is to understand positional scarcity, and I've put in brackets there probably the most key element of that, which is just not overdrafting goalkeepers. Now, last summer I devoted an entire episode to positional scarcity, and from that, value-based drafting as an extension of that idea. That was episode 132. If you want to go back and find it, I'll also put a link to it in the description below. By no means a beginner level episode, I'm not going to lie, but if you want to improve your draft day planning, it's well worth a re-listen, and as I said, I'll link that below. Picture this draft manager on draft day, mid-draft. They've taken Salah in round 1, Solanke in round 2, Robertson in round 3, and Ederson in round 4. They then sit back, eye up their blossoming squad, pleased that they've already got a solid option at each position, while all the other idiots seem to be squabbling over kind of mid-tier strikers. It's an easy trap to fall into when you're new, and believe me, it's a mistake. They'll find out in subsequent rounds of the draft when there are no more decent forwards or mids left to pick up. In the episode I mentioned a minute ago, episode 132, I go through a small worked example to explain why simply choosing the next player you think with the most points is not always the correct way to go. We have to consider the drop-off compared to other players in that position who may still be just as good in the next round or even the round after. This is why goalkeepers must be left until later in the draft, as the risk of losing the best goalkeeper, if that's even possible to predict on draft day, is really not that hard to stomach, because the drop-off to one of the average goalkeepers is not that far. Consider, on the other hand, not selecting an average starting striker or an above-average starting striker in the 4th round, maybe because you prefer a defender. By waiting just a single round to round 5, the level of strikers left for you to choose can quickly become dire, and you're then left facing a very long season with potentially only one, or at worst case, no reliable marksman. Tip number 3 is not to forget about game week 1. One of the big positives for draft is the ability to hold players for the campaign, safe in the knowledge they're only scoring for your team. This means we often have to overlook injuries or other risk factors if we think the value is still there for them in the long run. It also means we can be highly rewarded for backing players early on in the season. It's one of the biggest things I like about Draft FPL. As much as you need to have an eye on the rest of the year, come the game week 1 deadline in just a few weeks' time, you're still going to have to field an 11 that you're satisfied with going into that opening round of fixtures. The later draft rounds, I'm talking rounds 12, 13, 14, 15, are where you can make sure you're adding players that have strong opening fixtures or players who may be benefiting from other teammates being injured. These are not necessarily players you think will be up to it from now until game week 38. These are players that you won't have any guilt about potentially dropping in 1, 2 or even 3 game weeks time. They're very short term. I like to think of these picks as pre-season waiver pickups players you'd be grabbing for short-term stints during the proper season. Examples, for this season could be picking up Murillo for Forest. Forest have a very, very nice opening trio of fixtures. You're probably not going to want to keep him forever, but certainly for those few games, a very handy player to have in your squad. Another player that you might want to consider is Malo Gusto. The fixture's not quite as good, but it's a pretty rewarding position in terms of the Premier League as a whole. And we know that Reece James is suspended for a few games, so a very handy player potentially to have for the opening game weeks. Also, as we'll cover in our in-depth defender episode, a couple of lower mid-table defenders who rotate nicely on fixtures can also be very handy pickups in that late bracket of draft rounds. Next is number 4, and of course this practice makes perfect. One of the things you can do on the official FPL draft site is mock drafts. They're very easy to find. You can join them usually at fairly short notice. It waits for a few other managers to join in and you can draft away. These really are your friend, particularly if you're new. They're no match for the big day, but they'll get you comfortable with the nuts and bolts, the mechanics of making selections and quickly searching for players when you want them. They'll also give you some idea of who the popular picks are. Just be careful. In official FPL mock drafts, many managers will log on to or join one and then simply just won't do it or won't last beyond the opening couple of rounds. If that's the case, then what the FPL app will do is simply just take the next pick from their rankings and just auto pick them. So by that point, you're not really getting a fair idea of who popular players are. It will still let you do your stuff and pick players as you want to, but it probably won't give you much value in terms of working out which players to over or undervalue compared to the official FPL rankings. If it seems like you're in an engaged mock draft with picks that are deviating from the official FPL ranks, that's a mock to pay special attention to, because from that you can definitely learn things from. Doing these will also give you a better understanding of what I was talking about in point 2, which is that idea of positional scarcity. If you're not convinced, go and do a mock draft, pick a couple of goalkeepers in rounds 4 and 5. See how your squad stacks up against the rest and you'll soon be convinced. When doing these mock drafts, try and do them under exam conditions if you can, particularly the day before your proper draft day. Make sure you've got your notes, your spreadsheets handy. Make sure they're accessible in exactly the way you'll have them for the main event. If I'm drafting away from my house, I'll usually have my work accessible on and offline. Sometimes I'll take printed copies with me if I'm not 100% sure I can rely on the internet. So make sure you've got all of this sorted out before draft day itself. The last fail-safe, and probably most important, is the watch list in the FPL site. This can be found under the draft room tab. It means that if all contingencies fail and you're stuck in a lift somewhere when the draft starts, the team that's auto-drafted doesn't simply rely on the less than accurate official FPL rankings, but instead will look down your own watch list that you've created in the order that you've set it. So I usually say to people, putting 50 players in there is probably enough. You can obviously do more if you want to. Try not to go too over the top with it because it's quite time consuming to put it together. But at the very minimum, this will ensure that if you don't turn up on draft day, the team ends up resembling something that you want should you, as I said, fail to make the draft on time. My last point is to have an overall strategy to guide you, an ethos if you want. It's inevitable there will be points in the draft that player you had your eye on, the player you're about to take, gets picked by the player right before you. There will be moments where you're stuck between two players and you're sort of so stuck you're tempted to just toss a coin. There will also be drafts where you look at your opening selections, you may have gone through 3 or 4 rounds and you just don't feel satisfied with the team that you've already put together. Having a general strategy behind what you're doing will help guide you out of these tough spots. If you're not sure what your strategy is, or if you're new to Draft FPL, having never done a proper draft before, consider how you'd answer some of the following questions. If right now you had the 2nd, the 5th, or the 8th pick overall in the draft, and you're on the clock, do you know who you would take? Do you prefer players that have been around a bit, can deliver steady returns, or are you attracted to new signings with higher risk, higher upside? How do you feel about players from newly promoted clubs? Would you rather just avoid them? Are there particularly clubs you fancy to do well in the Premier League this season that you might want to target their players? Do you prefer sticking to Big 6 or Big 8 players as it is now? Or do you like owning the talisman from maybe some of the lower teams in the division? This is obviously not an exhaustive list, but you can start to see how by thinking about and pondering some of those questions, a strategy will emerge. It's also good to think about these things when you're putting your draft rankings together. You could rightly just say, you know what, I don't know much about Ipswich or Leicester or Southampton from last season. I was focused on the Premier League. I'm obviously aware of some of their players from when they were in the league prior to that, but generally we've seen in recent years the newly promoted clubs struggled to do well in the division. I'm just going to avoid putting their players in my draft rankings. Saves you a headache, saves you having to look into a few teams, and by no means anything wrong with that as part of your draft day prep. Means then when you're tied, when you're stuck between a couple of players, maybe one of them is Grealish for City and the other one is, who's a good example? Iwobi for Fulham. I don't know why you would be stuck between those two players. But if your ethos is, I want to try and load up on more players from the big clubs, then at least it gives you an easy nod towards Grealish. And a bonus tip for the pros out there, and maybe some of you new draft players, if you take some of my advice on board and do some good prep. Now, I've called this use time to your advantage. Now, on draft day itself, or before the draft is set up on the FPL app, the administrator, will decide how long each manager has for their draft picks. The shortest time you can set is 30 seconds, and I believe off the top of my head, the longest you can set it is 120 seconds, so 2 minutes, which in reality is probably too long. The sweet spot is somewhere towards the 60-second mark, I would say. But let's assume you put it at 30 seconds so you can get through the draft nice and quickly. Once you make your selection, the timer will instantly reset and the next manager is on the clock straight away. So my advice is this: don't hang around if you know who you want, especially in the earlier rounds, which you should have well mapped out. Quickly making a selection means that the manager after you, and even the manager after him, now have to very quickly gather their thoughts. They might have thought they had a good minute, even minute and a half to kind of think about who they're going to pick next. Bang, suddenly they're on the clock. Applying this time pressure consistently can only benefit a well-prepared draft manager such as yourself. And putting that pressure consistently on the rest of the league means you're more likely to force them to make a mistake, which, as I said, as the rounds continue to roll on, can only favour you. So that's it for this episode. Hopefully something in that for you, even if you are a seasoned draft FPL manager. If there was and you're watching this on YouTube, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe, as I said at the beginning, if you think this is going to be a useful channel for you down the stretch. If there are any tips you think I should have included that I haven't, then comment them down below and share that knowledge with some of the new players that might be finding this video for the first time. As well as subscribing, liking, commenting, and leaving reviews wherever you're listening, you can also keep up to date with what's going on at Draft FC on our socials. We are on X and Instagram. X is probably where we remain the most active, and you can follow us at draft_FC. This is where you can catch any updates we have. There's also the easiest place to get hold of me if you need to. Now, feel free to message me about any and all things draft or Premier League or football in general. I'm always happy to chat and give advice. One thing I would point out now is I don't always have time to look through your own draft rankings. I've had it before where people will just send me reams and reams and reams of lists of players that they've ranked together. Just remember, I'm obviously working on the Draft FC rankings every day to make sure that they're up to date and as accurate and as good as they can be for the members, so I don't always have the time to look through yours. Of course, if you want to see where my head's at with the rankings, then simply head to draftfc.co.uk and you'll be able to see my rankings in there. So otherwise, I will catch you all very soon on some more of Road to Draft Day 2024 content. And as always, stay sure.